So, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. It's so nice to see you all. And this is exciting because it's a warm welcome, and we are so proud to have our guest speaker on stage, who needs no introduction really. So he's been blogging a lot on LinkedIn, so you can read lots of his blogs. A former CTO, but he's been in many roles in ways of working, and he has more than a decade of experience in this field. So welcome, please welcome Chris Coombe on stage. And with that, I would hand it over to Chris. Please.
Thanks so much, Shal. Appreciate it. So let me just get the, is the screen record showing okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm just experimenting with a little feature in Zoom, so hopefully it works. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. And today, really what I wanted to talk about was sort of two things primarily. So one, I think we've all been through a fairly exhausting couple of years with COVID, and that's had, significant impact on the way we think about how we work, how we interact with people, the tooling, the processes and interactions. And then the flip side to that is also working in large, complicated or complex organizations. I think many people are going through a similar journey. I'm not going to be talking about the company that I work for today. I hope there's lots of parallels and observations that I've learned that may be of interest to you. And really, this is going to be a collection of things that I've seen, observed, both on the ground and also sharing with and from other people as well. So without further ado, the title slide is really a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. So I think working for any large organization, there's obviously a lot of inertia when you want to make changes. And so adopting the ideas of agility and changing ways of working is often quite challenging. So let me jump into the deck and we can get started. So who am I, just to begin with? Not the best photo of myself, but it was in a very fancy restaurant in France, in Paris, for my wife's birthday. So I figured I may as well look fancy. And in terms of my experience and where I'm from, I'm an Australian. You might not tell from my accent. It's sort of washed away over the years. I've lived in a number of different countries, everywhere from Spain and Belgium as a child to Singapore, Nashville in the States, and now recently in London in the UK. So I'm a little bit of a nomad in a sense. I sort of started my career working in the help desk, the level 1 help desk. So the very beginning of the food chain in terms of how people, customers interact with technology products and services. So I have a very strong appreciation and affinity for what it's like to be a customer and also what it's like to be yelled at and told just fix the damn thing. So anytime there's an outage or an incident, my heart stops for a beat, and obviously always worry about the colleagues on the other side of the fence and the challenges that they're facing. I recently updated this slide to also include Mastodon, not just Twitter, because I think clearly that's the topic of the week. Given some of the news with Twitter. So I thought I'd be a little bit relevant and timely with that one. I'm still figuring out how it works and what it actually does, but I think I'm signed up. so at least that's my first step into yet another social media platform. So to get on with things, really the focus here is to think about large complex organizations, and this could be any industry, any sort of material size and scale, anything from sort of, 20,000 people and above. The experience that I've had is certainly in a few different companies, but principally where I'm working at the moment, companies really have their own sense of gravity. And what I mean by that is not from a sort of a fancy perspective, but really just in terms of the way things move, how decisions get made, how information flows through, how things get done. We know, from physics, black holes, what they do to information, right? So when we talk about large complex organizations, I think it's really interesting to sort of observe the effect that communication channels, information paths, how things get done really go about happening. And so when I apply a way of working lens, that's really, what this deck is going to be about today. So one of the things I've observed principally is really a lot of organizations have gone through a similar cycle over time where they're looking to save money, they're looking to be efficient historically, and now they're starting to sort of make observations off the back of COVID. You know, the efficiency play only really gets you so far. So you know, things like, you know, Lean and Six Sigma with a very sort of process-centric lens really have only gotten us to a certain level when it comes to knowledge work where we can really optimize locally. It's been very hard to optimize globally, and therefore people have historically done, you know, process improvement, process engineering type projects where we focus on maximizing efficiency of a team or of a process. And quite often, as we know from, you know, theory of constraints and, you know, value stream mapping and all these sorts of topics, that if you only localize, if you only optimize locally, there we go, you obviously get very different results. And so you get high use of efficiency in terms of, sorry, high usage of resources. That'll give you some resource efficiency, right? Teams will be busy, like I mentioned earlier around help desks. The help desks themselves can be very busy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a benefit from a customer perspective. And so I think we've all faced a situation, especially with COVID. Grocery stores were running out of, you know, all sorts of groceries. You know, toilet paper was another one. And if you only optimize just purely on, you know, making sure that the staff are busy, you're obviously leaving something on the table from a value perspective and principally in terms of the customer. And I don't know about you, but I don't like lining up in long lines that take forever. And so it's important that we think about things from a flow and a customer perspective as well. So I mentioned COVID a couple of times already. I think many organizations had different reactions to this, but I think in terms of how many sort of approached it from what I've observed, people were sort of put into a situation where they had to react quickly. People were in obviously office buildings and mostly sort of collectively working in an office context. They may not have necessarily been all co-located. They may have been working in you know, buildings around the world, which is pretty common for large complex organizations. And so with COVID, people started to, I guess they were forced to make decisions quickly because, you know, they didn't have a choice. And so what we observed, at least where we work, was basically that you need to sort of observe those quick decisions and actually reflect on why they were good, and not just, you know, things can be better, but actually because push comes to shove, when companies really need to make decisions quickly, they actually can. And so I think there's an opportunity there for us to potentially capitalize on that, to say there is a better way. What if we acted like when we were in COVID, when we made decisions more quickly and we got those feedback loops? We wanted that to be the way things are on a day-to-day basis. I don't mean the whole COVID experience, of course, but just simply when people made decisions, things can be better and things can work differently. And so for me, that was kind of, for some organizations, a real world example of what, you know, making decisions in a timely manner meant and what that enabled as a result. So that could be in many cases, you know, working from home on a mass scale for organizations, having to make concessions about where people work and what sort of approach they use to work from home and the like. So I mentioned before, people were making decisions more quickly in organizations as a result of COVID. We don't really know, or at least I don't really know at this stage, whether that was because they were forced into the situation or because they, you know, cognitively knew that they needed to do that. I think in many cases, we probably recognize that people made those decisions because they were pushed into the corner and they had to act, and therefore that was the only option to take. And we know from COVID, we know from Kinevin that, you know, in the complex domain, that, you know, sometimes the best thing to do is to act first, you know, and see what that manifests. So, you know, I think here the image is illustrative of, you know, a shallow dive into chaos. Really was a taste of what COVID was like for people. We didn't know that there were going to be vaccines or when there would be vaccines. We didn't know how long COVID would last. And so there are a lot of first-time experiences for many people. And so I think that sort of triggered a lot of behavior change. And the question really for me is, did we do that intentionally, or was it just because of the situation we found ourselves in? So I mentioned a little bit about working from home and the results of that from COVID. I think many organizations put themselves into a situation where they had to trust people on an enormous scale. In many cases, working from home was sometimes treated as a privilege for people. So if I trust my team, if I trust my employees to work from home, they're allowed to work from home for 1 or 2 days a week, and that is the privilege I bestow upon them. That was often some of the rhetoric that we saw in the past. And so the question here is, we were forced as organizations who maybe didn't have that experience in the past to trust people on scale, en masse, to work from home. I think we've seen many articles already as to whether, people were taking a big brother approach and monitoring productivity. Are my people logged in? Are they productive? Are they, actively engaging in their work, or are they, watching Netflix on the side and got their feet, on the table, those sorts of situations. So I don't know at this stage en masse whether organizations have actually learnt to trust people in a ways of working sense. Can people work from home? I think they've learnt to deal with it as a reality, but I think there's many people who still feel uncomfortable that they're doing it because that's more what people are doing now, as opposed to, we actually want to improve the experience for many people. We want it to be a pleasurable experience to come to the office. We want people to be able to do deep work and deep thinking from home. And we want sort of the best of both from a hybrid perspective. And so I think it's early days, but I think it's really interesting to look at different companies in terms of how they've reacted and responded. I know some companies, for example, that have been remote from day one. So GitLab is a fantastic case study there in terms of they've always been remote. I don't really think COVID made a dent on them in terms of their ways of working, but it's very different for companies who were mostly in the office. So the next one, I sort of observed really that, with COVID, there was a lot of emphasis on speeding things up. I don't know whether that's because we didn't have visibility of everyone. People were distributed around the world working from home, but I observed a sense of increased urgency, increased acceleration about wanting to sort of speed things up from a program or a transformation perspective. I think many people have continued to observe, but maybe an increase recently about changing in ways of working. Obviously DevOps has been around for a long time now, but people adopting further engineering practices, DevOps practices, digitalization, whatever that means, adoption of cloud, and so on. And so really, we've observed many people focusing on these as levers, as a way to become more reactive to the market and also to their employees as well. So I think companies really have had different options around how they approach, what acceleration means for them. I think the reasons, the outcomes, and the drivers are obviously going to be different for every individual organization, where they are today, where they've been in the past, and what they're actually looking to achieve in the future. So some people have jumped into making decisions quickly, others have taken a longer period of time, but I think it's clear to say that there are different paths, and we'll talk about some of those paths throughout the slide. And the one thing that I think I'm starting to see, at least, is that there's more to sort of value and outcomes than perhaps people have taken appreciation for. So I think many people have seen in the past that productivity has been about basically output, the number of things that we've done, deliverables, we've done releases, things have happened. Certainly in heavily regulated organizations, there's a big emphasis on meeting deadlines, regulatory deliverables, and so on. And so I think off the back of COVID and certainly, the focus on accelerating, I think people are starting to change the dial. And also, obviously books like Sooner, Safer, Happier have contributed to that as well. People are starting to talk about outcomes. OKRs have also introduced some of these sorts of ideas about outcomes, objectives, and the like. And, we definitely start to observe that people are now starting to talk a little bit more step by step about value and thinking more about a change in results, and rather than just something being done or a number of things being delivered on time, what's the actual benefit or impact of the work that we've done. So I think that's a really positive step, that people are starting to have that conversation in general. I think it's been difficult for people to make the move from thinking purely about output and starting to think about outcomes, certainly in areas where it's very heavily biased towards deliverables and getting things done. So that's part of the journey that everyone's on. So one of the things that we started to see as well was the need for change. So I mentioned people keep talking about acceleration, going faster feedback loops, starting to talk about outcomes and value. I think this is almost like a sort of a reason or a sense of urgency that people are starting to feel, and that's what's been fueling a lot of the sort of the emphasis around transformation, acceleration, and so on. And that's been historically challenging to find that driver for urgency. What's the reason for change? I think many organizations have their own different perspective on that, and maybe COVID has started to crystallize that for a lot of people. They now have that reason. And so, we already mentioned that decisions got made more quickly in the past COVID sort of context. I don't know whether those same decisions are now moving as quickly as they were during COVID. Have things slowed down? Is there more red tape? Is there less red tape? I certainly have observed that people were speaking quite positively in a weird sense during COVID about things happening more quickly, a lot less unnecessary meetings. People would be open to approving and just getting things done that needed to be done. Whereas before they possibly wanted to have more meetings and apply a level of bureaucracy about it. So I think that's quite a positive step as well. But the key message here is really, how sustainable is that? Is that a long-term embedded behavior change, or is that just something that we coped with during the pandemic? So for those organizations looking at the options available to them, there's always a risk when you talk about accelerating, improving, outcomes and focusing on value. There's lots of shiny new toys, whether that's, vendor products, the latest, greatest thing that's come out to the market, whether it's a prepackaged ways of working solution from, one of the scaled companies. People looking for solutions will obviously find solutions. And the message here is really that, be wary of temptations, be wary of snake oil. And certainly when you're in a hurry as an organization, it's very easy to think that thing that you're observing off the shelf that apparently solves all your problems is potentially a panacea and not really going to get you there where you need to be. So please consider those options and don't jump into them quickly, especially if they're prepackaged. And certainly these sorts of meetups are a great place to talk to colleagues who've been through similar situations before and can share their learnings. So I think many organizations find themselves asking the question, where do we begin? What sort of outcomes are we really after? We've certainly observed people saying, I want to be agile, make me agile, my hands up, I need to be agile because that's what people are saying I need to be. But I think in many cases, when you delve deeper and sort of, politely challenge them, what does that actually mean? I think in many cases, people don't necessarily have a robust answer as to why they want to be agile or what actual problem or outcomes that they're after. And so we tend to try and, delve deeper into the whys. We don't necessarily need to go to 5 whys, but to get to the bottom of the problem that people want to solve with changing ways of working. It's not just, make me agile, get the t-shirt. It's think about what problems you want to solve and how we can apply better ways of working as a result. And then crucially, how do we approach solving those problems? I mentioned before, there's a lot of different options. We know from Sooner, Safer, Happier, one of the things that I think from the book that sticks with me to this day is, you have the ability to invite people to come on the journey, or what is quite commonly referred to as inflicting on people. So where you push as opposed to pull, changing in ways of working. And so I think that's something really important that people don't give enough time to think about and appreciate. And when people and organizations in particular are looking for results, they're very easily tempted by those off-the-shelf solutions, whether it's around scaling agile or something else, a shiny package thing that looks good. People tend to want to get results quickly, and so therefore they want to roll things out in a traditional waterfall approach, if I can call waterfall traditional, and therefore they're looking for the results more quickly. And what I've observed in different organizations is that they tend to treat rolling out agile as if it's a waterfall project or program, and that is really not how it works in reality, and it's not how it embeds. And so you don't start doing agile one day and then your transformation is complete 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later. You really only just start to go on the journey, and you change your behavior over time. I think one of the things I've been reflecting on recently about learning and about embedding new skills is that when you go on this journey, you're sort of observing, or people naturally are looking for answers. Tell me how to do this. What's the best practice? How do I do this new thing? Give me a checklist so that I can follow this process and do things properly. And many people have come from a world where they're used to being, dare I say it, spoon-fed about how do I do my job? What's the role description? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think many people can relate to that sort of context. And I feel like changing the ways of working for people often takes away the safety net, and the onus is actually on them to sort of stand up and to learn and experiment. And quite often, practitioners of ways of working and agile and so on don't always have the answers that people are looking for. And I think that's very healthy, and I think that's fine. And the challenge is to find out the answers together. But many people find that really scary. So I think that's something to be aware of as well as we go on that journey. And I mentioned already that everyone has sort of put their hand up and said, make me agile. I want to be agile. I think it's important to communicate to people and over communicate, and we'll obviously get to that a little bit later as well. I think in the Sooner, Safer, Happier book, you sort of communicate until you're blue in the face, and then keep communicating some more to get the message across. I think there's certainly for sort of the laggards or the late adopters of changing ways of working, people are very keen to hurry up and get on that bandwagon. And so it's more about, am I now doing the agile thing, as opposed to, are we getting the outcomes? So one of the other areas that I've observed is people have started to talk about things such as platforms, marketplaces, and ecosystems. So, there's a lot of examples. The individual ones aren't so important, but obviously Amazon is a marketplace. You can sell goods and services on there, and anyone in the world can effectively buy them. Netflix obviously has effectively television and movies on demand, streaming, Spotify, and so on. And so there's certainly been questions and discussions I've been involved in where people start to talk about, how do I become the, app store of a certain industry? How do I become the Netflix of a certain industry? And what does that mean for the organization or the industry that a given company is in? And I think that's really interesting, because it almost forces people to think outside of their own context and take a sort of a network or an ecosystem thinking about what they're doing. And I think that's really positive. Anyway, so it's more about the wider economy, the wider ecosystem, and I think that's a positive outside-in feedback loop for people to consider as well. So we know organizations all tend to take a different approach with regards to ways of working, transformations in general, and sometimes there's an element of big bang. Sometimes there's an element of what I tend to refer to as controlled explosions or controlled blasts, lots of mini big bangs. And there's different ways of doing this stuff. I love the invite over inflict option. I think if you're not familiar with what Dan Mezek's been doing in open space agility as well, there's a lot of other really good resources around getting people engaged, getting them on the journey and making them participate and come along that journey as well. And I think there's really a sense of ownership and embedding when people have a choice and how to get involved. So I would say definitely focus on trying to capitalize that opportunity that you have. So one of the other things that sort of plagues many industries is that people often mistakenly think that business agility effectively has turned into organization design. I'm not going to blame any individual group or industry, but I've seen it time and time again, whether that's, we will adopt the Spotify model that's not a model, whether that's a prepackaged scaled agile solution or something else. But people tend to sort of conflate that agility is organizing purely into, cross-functional teams, whether that's, squads, tribes, and so on, and kind of miss the bigger picture. And certainly for anyone who's studied any of the Spotify engineering culture, the magic to me around that is actually the concept of the chapters and guilds and the community of learning. That's actually where the magic happens, rather than, whether it's just, something like a cross-functional team, which we've seen, time and time again. So business agility is much more than forming into those organizational structures. And so as we talk about ways of working and agility, often it sort of manifests in a number of common patterns and mechanisms. So, we've observed there's obviously a big focus on product and customer centricity. I think that's a really good thing. I don't think that's negative. There are side effects that can happen when you start thinking about products and that's all you think about. So we'll maybe talk a little bit about that later. I think the notion of funding capacity and teams is really important, but again, can be quite dangerous if you don't think through what it means, or you just roll it out to everyone without sort of experimenting and building the learning along the way. I think I added this one, value stream funding, I think is kind of the next level or the next evolution of funding teams and capacity. Certainly, I don't have experience with funding value streams, but I think it's really an interesting way of trying to address some of the problems that sort of extend beyond an individual silo and focus on the customer journey itself. And so I think that's really something to be thinking about, rather than just funding teams by itself. Thinking about it from a value stream perspective, then it really allows you to align towards the customer rather than sort of organizational or divisional lines. Another common one is really around establishing strategies and goal alignment mechanisms. So OKRs, having regular planning activities, quarterly business reviews, and the like. I think people are starting to see more often. That sort of forces people into thinking, or almost asking the question at an executive level, what's happening in the next quarter? What are the outcomes that we're looking for, as opposed to show me the detailed plan over the next 9, 12, 18 months and so on. And so that's a good feedback mechanism, I think. But I tend to see people focusing on deliverables as they're getting up to speed rather than the outcome. So there's obviously a barrier to entry and a learning curve. I've spoken to many people who think of themselves as experts on OKRs, who generally share that it often takes about 18 months to get good at OKRs as an organization. That feels too long to me, but it sounds about right. In terms of human nature, I think the key thing is to keep working on it and focusing on how things get better. So certainly in Sooner, Safer, Happier, they talk about the value realization office. I think it is good to have an outside-in perspective of challenging the way OKRs are written. Do they make sense? Are they written in a way that allows us to think about the outcome as opposed to sort of gamifying the deliverable, right? And so these are really important. I'll quickly sort of summarize the rest. But I think the other elements to consider are really what roles look like in an organization. So many companies have a HR system of some sort, and that allows you to customize the roles that you offer in an organization. If you just pick on a typical large organization with a technology department, they may have many engineering types of roles. They may have many different other types of roles, testers, business analysts, project managers, et cetera, et cetera. So, one of the things that people are looking at is they're trying to rationalize, do we have too many roles in general? Do we have a very lumpy distribution? Are there only 3 people with a certain type of role and maybe too many with another type, where actually if we consolidated the number of roles we have and focus on what I've taken on board is the generalizing specialist type approach. So people talk about T shaping and M shaping, pi shaping, and all sorts of other weird and wonderful shapes. There's an excellent article on Medium. I forget the name of the writer who even came up with something called Cthulhu shaping, which is the mythical creature that's basically an octopus. So it has lots of tendrils to sort of illustrate that you can really go far in terms of depth and breadth. And I think that's a big change for people. People are not used to thinking about necessarily expertise as I am good at many different things, and that's a good thing, having breadth of knowledge as well as depth. So I think that's another challenge that people find themselves in, where I am an expert in XYZ area or capability. Now I'm being told to become a generalist and learn all these other things. That's really hard for people who've gone down a very narrow path. I don't think there's anything wrong with experts. I think it's good to have experts, but I think if you're working in cross-functional teams, it's very hard to get work done if everyone in the team or squad, whatever language you want to use, is an individual with an individual set of skills. And the only way work can get done is if every single person lines up individually like a relay race and passes the baton over one to one. The bus problem is often referred to in this case, where if someone gets hit by a bus, or ideally they take a bus rather than getting run over to leave for another company, then that puts the whole team at a disadvantage. And so it makes it really challenging to deliver value in a sort of repeatable, predictable way, right? If you always need XYZ expert in your team to do something and you can't do it, then that's a challenge to look into, especially around skill mapping and capability building. And the other last one, which I'll say here, is around untangling dependencies, or what Sooner, Safer, Happier in the book referred to as impediments. I think John said before, impediments are not in the way, they are the way, right? And I think as we start to empower teams and give them more autonomy, you can't do that unless you're actively spending time focusing on addressing impediments and actually solving them. And, I hear lots of conversations about, I've empowered the teams, but they're not doing, what they're supposed to. It's because of the dependencies. It's because of the impediments that are in the way. And I think that the job of leadership, and I don't mean people who are managers, I mean people who are taking on leadership qualities. The idea there is that they should be helping address these impediments and solving them and communicating them to everyone, so that that's a thing that leadership is actively involved in and contributing to. So I mentioned already products, potentially a interesting angle and a path to go down, but there's a double-edged sword. I've seen many cases where people really think about everything being a product, and to the point where I'm going to do a process or an activity and that's a product now because that's what my team does. So a word of caution: just because you're applying a product lens and product centricity to the work that a team does, I'm not just talking about cross-functional teams delivering a product, but any organization who's doing operational teams, shared service type stuff, you can apply a product lens to that without making everything you do a product. And I think it's a slippery slope. And it can be quite alluring, just as I mentioned with, make me agile. People can say, make my team, make my process, make my service a product. And, applying that thinking is useful, but turning everything into a product is potentially not. And the other sort of challenge as well is when we talk about funding teams, if you give teams a pot of money and they're told they are autonomous and empowered, the first thing that many of those teams will do is put up the silos. My camera's a bit zoomed in, bring my hands up closer. And they will tend to want to ignore what everyone else wants for them and actually start to do things that they want to do. which for them is potentially a privilege. And that's what very quickly creates challenges in the organization, where people have struggled in the past, where they've had to fund projects in order for people to do work. It was very clear what the priorities were when you have funded projects, because you follow the money, and the money is what drives the prioritization. And when you fund the capacity of the teams, you don't have that same carrot or stick, depending on how you want to call it. So what happens is teams sort of shout hallelujah and then start doing what they want. And I think it's really important. I've heard Zsolt and others talk about it as well, is this notion of the golden thread, which is sort of tying the business strategy all the way down to the teams. And if you're not aligning the work, and I don't like the word cascade in terms of OKRs, but if teams and teams of teams and beyond are not thinking about some of the work that they're doing in the context of the wider organization, you're really missing out. And in many cases, you're about to have a sort of multi-lane car pileup, because teams depend on each other. And when you start changing your ways of working journey, moving towards funding teams, you definitely are going to end up with a lot of impediments that need to be solved before teams can actually get a bit more autonomy around the way that they work. So I love the office, the American and the English one, but the way I've observed teams is almost like a Mexican standoff. So teams who've got the capacity funding, they've got dependencies, they need other people, other teams to do work from them. But those same teams now have their capacity and they don't want to help each other. So it ends up being a sort of true Mexican standoff, right? And what I've observed is that people don't know how to collaborate across different teams now that they've got the capacity. So it's almost like something has switched and they no longer know how to collaborate with each other. So this is something to look out for. There are no silver bullets other than, actually learn to collaborate, spend time talking to teams, align on shared goals or OKRs and outcomes, and focus about the organizational needs rather than just the team's needs. The other one is really to identify what's valuable. So when we talk about goals, whether it's from a customer or a business perspective, focus on the goals itself. It doesn't mean that all the work that the teams are doing have to be 100% aligned to OKRs and shared goals as a result. But it does mean that a percentage or a distribution of the work that each of the teams are doing should contribute to the organizational goals that people have, because otherwise, without that central point of convergence, the outcome that we want for the organization, it's going to be very difficult for people to align and collaborate and get things to be delivered sort of at a particular point in time, because without those shared goals, people are going to have other priorities and other interests. So I mentioned earlier about the organizational silo opportunity when people mistakenly think of cross-functional teams, team squads, tribes, and the like, as being sort of the silver bullet. Be very careful with that. People have created those because they look great, and using the terms and forming into those organizational structures allow you to sort of wear the jersey, I guess, of agility. But what tends to happen, unless you think about things from a value stream perspective, is that they tend to get built up and organized into organizational structure silos. And so rather than thinking about things as a value stream, people tend to say, this is the organizational context that I find myself in, and there's other people that I need to get work done, but they're not in my organization, so I will not include them into my collaboration, into my events, and therefore not into my planning. And that's really where the dependencies and the impediments tend to get turned up to 11. So I would suggest to do your homework, to experiment and to improve. And I think, we see many people who spend a lot of time focusing on the organizational design as the main event. I think that can be useful when you think about products, but think of it more as software. So, these days there is no final version of a product, right? You iterate, you have version 1, version 2, version 3, and so on. And so thinking about organizational design in that manner has to be a better way than just saying the organization needs to come together and it needs to be perfect. And then because we've invested so much time in getting people to align and to form into this organizational structure, it sort of almost creates a new fragility that we don't want to change the organization anymore because we've invested so much time and effort into making it what we think of as correct. And so we really focus on trying to make it an incremental change to org structure. So again, sort of the idea of invite over inflict. There's a wonderful book that Jim Benson's just released called The Collaboration Equation, which I highly recommend. It talks about sort of all sorts of things, but obviously PDSA is a big one in terms of continuous improvement, and that extends to everything. So the work that you do, the way that you think about doing your work, so your ways of working, but also the way you think about, you know, the broader ways of working from a meta sense as well. So, you know, whether that's operating model design, organizational design, and so on. And so all of that should be looked at in terms of iterating and improving. And sometimes agile coaches will get involved, or whatever flavor you want to call them. But I've observed when you have too many agile coaches in one location, they don't tend to play nicely with each other when they've not aligned on common objectives and goals themselves. So I've had the pleasure of building a team of agile coaches over the past year or so, and they very rarely tend to agree on much. They all have very clear opinions. I've been an architect and a CTO before, so this is not my first rodeo in terms of having people who answer it depends on many such occasions. And so, you know, one of the things we start to do is try and focus on how coaches can collaborate and share together, as opposed to just going in as individuals working with people from a ways of working perspective. Go in as a team, pair and learn with each other, so that, you know, collectively I can learn from them, they can learn from me, and we'll start to sort of uncover problems that we've not seen before and actually be able to share more broadly. I mentioned the ability to focus on improving roles, and, you know, whether that's consolidating so that you have more generalists. I think this is really important, not only from just an organizational construct sense to simplify the organization, to give people a role framework of how do I progress in the organization, whether that's from a skill development perspective. I know Emily Weber and a number of people have done some good work in this space around role frameworks and capability frameworks, I think they call them, how to develop, how to build, you know, and if I'm a junior engineer, how do I get to a more senior engineer levels, and those sorts of things. And they can be really helpful for people on their journey to know what those stepping stones are in terms of increasing their responsibility or contributions more broadly. And I think if they're really well defined, I think it was Dropbox who shared theirs publicly on a GitHub static page. It really acts as a mechanism to share culture and behavior in terms of how these are written. And so this is a really good opportunity to infuse not only the ways of working, but the ways of acting as well in terms of culture and behavior. So think about it from that perspective also. The other thing I'd say, just to sort of keep things moving, is beware of overload. So when you're doing capital A, capital T, Agile Transformation, this can be quite exhausting for the people involved, but also the people who are having things foisted onto them for no apparent reason. And so lots of big organizational redesigns, lots of big bang changing, whether that's organizational structures, line managers, you know, you are now baptized as a you know, product owner, scrum master, these sorts of things. They can be really scary and really overwhelming for people. And if you're trying to learn how to do a new role and adopt new practices and skills, people need time to take up those new skills. And quite often, you know, people are not aware of how much capacity is required in order for people to get up to speed. And so, you know, be good to each other, give each other some capacity and some ability to actually learn, rather than, you know, throw people into the frying pan after a go live of becoming agile announced and those sorts of things. So we'll talk quickly about metrics here. I think it's important that metrics exist and that we think about them and discuss them, but they can be very dangerous in the wrong hands. And so, you know, be careful what you measure, because that has a very big influence on the sorts of behaviors that you'll observe in organizations. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'll probably skip a couple of slides, but there's really great material in the book Sooner, Safer, Happier about the better value, sooner, safer, happier metrics. So I'd suggest you look at those. People will be familiar with some of the metrics that are linked to, such as the DORA metrics. such as the flow metrics, right? Things like lead time, work in progress, flow efficiency, and the like. And I think the important one that people don't often spend enough time thinking about is the happier aspect. So that's happier for people in teams, colleagues, customers, citizens, and climate. And I think if we all looked at that as well, then I think that would have quite an oops, I'm sorry, I have done something weird. Then I think that would have the impact that we're looking for. So that is the end of my talk, and I will stop for slides. Sorry, for questions. I will stop the slides for questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This was amazing, brilliant. Thank you so much. So any questions? Questions, please.
I'll get the ball rolling, Chris. It was a brilliant talk. There was a lot in there. And it's lovely to be reminded of a lot of the things that, I think we all go through when we're trying to encourage change and engage people in change and so on. It's lovely to hear your perspective on it. And one of the things that resonates for me at the moment, I'm at the start of an engagement, so there are those aspects of it depends how you frame it, isn't it? But teach me, show me the thing, me the thing. I just wondered how you felt about things like shuhari, the fact that right at the beginning, people do cry out for just show me the thing, and then is it wrong of us to say I'm not going to show you the thing, it has to be in context, or like the panacea. Would it be wrong of us to say to people like, well, just for now, just think of this as a panacea, just do it, just go with it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I've got a sort of a mature answer around it, but my current thinking is, I think if you go into it transparently with people and you talk to them about, look, this is typically the steps that people go through, the cycle that they go through for learning new practices. We know you're going to have questions. We know you're going to question why we're doing something. And we'll go through that journey together. And I may not have the answers. You may have to come up with the answers, but we'll do it together, and we'll do it as a group. I think that's, to me, the message that's important. I do think there's an oversimplification with ideas of shuhari, as in, ways of working is complex. It's not filling out a form, right? It's not simple work. And so I like the notion of what shuhari and any other sort of simple progression model gives you. I think it can be overplayed and overused if it's not done in the context of, we're just going to start you off, we're going to get the ball rolling. And the other thing as well with shuhari is that unintentionally people can also treat people like they should be at the beginning, when perhaps they've already invested their own time and learnings on their journey. And so if you put everyone into the one out of the three option, you very quickly run the risk of frustrating people who may have already spent a lot of time on their own journey. So don't start at the bottom blindly just because, I'd say.
Yeah, great point. Sometimes I wonder whether it's more like learning language. Where you actually sometimes when you're not primary school, but when you're in secondary school and someone's teaching you how to ask for the shoe shop, I'm never going to do that. Just teach me the word teach me all the swear words. What's the word on the street?
Indeed.
But yeah, great point. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Questions, please.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick with Matt. I actually took a lot of notes during this, so just some feedback. The breadth, I agree, the breadth of your presentation was very broad, right? And it covered all really key elements. So I started to write all these questions down, and there are so many. So it's not that there aren't any questions, there are a lot of questions. So when I flip back through, you're talking about what our outcomes are we after. One thing that I've encouraged people to ask, especially, so for example, my wife is now looking for a new job, and I asked her to ask the questions would be, can you explain what flow looks like at your company? How does ideation to production happen? you know, and I'll give you a lot of feedback on the culture. But I think your key, I mean, you just touched every key element that I can ask. So what are the outcomes we're looking for? I think with your cross-functional teams that I've learned, and I really love that you'll reiterate this and carry this forward, is that you can't just have cross-functional teams. They become functional units themselves unless there's value streams or you have some mechanism to really help them deliver that flow. Another point was your collaboration with Agile leaders. So same thing, as we kind of regrouped our Agile leadership group, some are Scrum Master, some Kanban, but we follow the Agile leadership name just because we don't necessarily follow Scrum at our organization. But once we got them aligned and started talking about business alignment and shared goals of each of their teams in that, they all bring different styles, but it really did build that collaboration. We didn't have the friction anymore. They were really aligned and supporting each other. And then the one thing that I get in heated conversations with, or just really strong conversations with right now, is we try to adopt our own value stream management tool. We try to build it in-house. And the metrics is, I really preach, and the board members don't like this, that the problem is the business gets involved, right? If you can separate the business and have the teams use a dashboard and have valuable metrics that will help them improve, the other numbers will change and they'll look good for the business and things like that. And so as you get into the metrics and the door metrics, I'm just constantly pulled into, you know, what these means and how. And then finally, so I don't take up all the additional times, team health, always, you know, just measuring that team health is a goal. And I left a bunch of stuff off. So rather than asking the questions I had, I just wanted to compliment you on the breadth of really key areas you covered. This was a really broad, but very valuable. I think you consolidated, just unpacked a lot of key areas that make a difference.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you so much. Anybody else?
Jan, is it Jan or Jan? Apologies if I've got that wrong, but has a question in the chat. Do you have any tips on managing Agile coaches who have difficulties agreeing on what to do next?
It's a great question. It's very easy to make fun of, you know, I don't know what the collective pronoun is of a group of Agile coaches, right? But I'm sure there's some jokes to be had around that. I think it's often a case of focusing on who the coaching is going to be applied to, and actually talking about the problems that people are facing, rather than what, you know, secret ninja moves the coaches should use, you know, what book, what video, what practice. Because I find people tend to get potentially religious or competitive with, you know, my favorite flavor of, you know, whether it's Scrum, Kanban, XP, et cetera, and it almost misses the point where it's really about the problems that people are having, rather than, you know, which flavor of ice cream you're going to be using. And so I think, you know, from my perspective, anyone who considers themselves a practitioner of ways of working and agility, if you only have one flavor of ice cream, I am an expert in Scrum, I am an expert only in Kanban, you're missing out, because there's a rich tapestry of practices and none of them solve all problems. And so you need those different you know, flavors of ice cream. I guess I'm getting hungry for dinner, but flavors of ice cream, so that you can think about the different contexts and problems that you find yourself in. And so I think if you move the focus away from Agile coaches and what's the best, you know, flavor of the month practice, then it allows you to sort of experiment and try different things with the people that you're working with.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I was just going to say one, like in response to that, and I think probably like to the whole group as well, is that the French have a lovely saying, and I can't say it in French, but it's the fate of glass to break. You know, glass breaks, and I think a lot of us here we want to fix things, don't we? We want to make it right, and I suppose, like, you know, wrapping it around that question is that what's the next thing, what, you know, difficult to agree on what to do next. I think as long as if you don't let the entropy set in and do something next, you might not fix it, but you might discover someone else another thing to do. And I think it's just that, because things will break. You could come up with the perfect thing to do next, and it will be fit for purpose for a period of time, and then it will cease to be fit for purpose. So I think, I mean, like you were saying about having groups of agile coaches, I think it's just working as a team,
Exactly.
pulling on different ideas, isn't it? And I think keeping the ideas flowing, I suppose, is a good approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah, can't fix everything.
I have a question as well, Chris. So you mentioned I'm a huge fan of learning organization. You mentioned a lot around ecosystem. I love that word. In terms of community of practice, because I know my experience, many organizations get the concept, but they really struggle to actually make it happen as a really good working communities of practices. What's your experience in that?
So I would say it's a bit mixed at the moment from what I've observed. I think there's a lot of intentionality and excitement that people go on the journey around. I think the challenge or the peril is that I mentioned earlier with the Spotify model guilds and chapters and so on, these ideas get introduced to organizations, but generally, and again, there's a massive oversimplification, right, or generalization, is that these ideas get introduced, but not necessarily with a group of people who've done this before. And so everyone is almost going through the learning and setting up these communities of practice. Maybe if you're lucky, you've hired in some people from other organizations who can help inject that learning and experience. But I think many people find themselves starting from scratch and just being told, go and set up a guild for XYZ profession. And I think, to me, actually, that's somewhat some opportunity where agile coaches or ways of working practitioners can actually work with the guilds to get them to think about how they set stuff up. They shouldn't be expecting that they're an expert in every single profession in an organization, but they should be thinking about things like, what's the purpose of this guild? What problems do we want to solve? What's the average sort of capability that people have that they want to learn of, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that the one thing I'd say as a takeaway is that unless people make the capacity in the organization to invest in it. And what I mean is, it's very easy for people to say, there's another thing people have to do. Now they need to attend some chapter meeting, some guild meeting on a periodic basis. And that's seen as a detractor, as opposed to, holy crap, these people get to talk to all these other people in the organization and they can learn and they can come back charged, they can come back motivated, they can learn new skills, and they can connect the dots across the organization and maybe help with regards to impediments. So unless people create that capacity and the space to learn, I think you're kind of limited with the impact that those sorts of communities of practice and guilds can offer.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Amani, you have a question.
Yeah, really quickly. I know it's sort of on time, but I'm just curious to know whether, I'm sure you're in a similar situation where you're invited into orgs to try and help with their journey, outcome, whatever it may be. And then you're often told to go and fix some issues with certain teams. So they're looking outward onto problems, and it's usually the team because they're not delivering or they're not predictable enough. And I often find that really interesting because the leader who's asking for that, I kind of like intrinsically look at like, okay, what are you exhibiting? What are you behaving? So I'm just interested to sort of understand if you've kind of been in that situation, how have you dealt with it? And what you do with leadership teams?
So I mean, again, not to keep plugging the book, this refers to the frozen middle, right? And so there's many examples of organizations who have, let's call it management or leadership, who have a sort of systemic view of their context, and they observe problems that they see, things are not working, and they don't necessarily have the tools, whether from a ways of working perspective, so that they start to assume, a team is not doing its job. I've seen cases where they say they're not disciplined enough, they don't have the right skills, and we need to hire better engineers or better XYZ, role in order for things to happen. But in reality, it's because of the impediments and the dependencies that people have. So I think of many organizations as big balls of string that are sort of hampered by all of the dependencies that they have. So unless you can sort of visualize the value stream and trace the dependencies that people have, you're only going to get very sort of low yields of benefit if you focus purely on an individual team. So visualizing that, having a visual system for control, showing what that looks like to the leader or manager who is, you know, making the assertion that something's wrong with the team, you know, will then tell them where work is flowing in, where work flows out. And that will very quickly sort of paint a rich picture of what's actually the reality of how work is unfold. And so there's no silver bullets, but if you can visualize it and build people into the process where they're collaborating and helping contribute to what that picture looks like, tools like Miro and so on are super useful with doing that and making it collaborative. But I think you can build that trust by helping have them collaborate and contribute to that view of the value stream.
I was on mute, sorry, thank you so much. Thank you for the question and the answer. I think it was awesome. So thank you again, Chris, and thank you everybody for being here. All your questions, they're gonna be the recording. We're gonna put on YouTube. I'm gonna definitely watch it again. And so it's time for feedback, isn't it, Matt?